August 7, 1943, marked a pivotal moment in the Pacific War. On that day, U.S. Marines launched a daring amphibious assault on the island of Vella La Vella in the Solomon Islands. It was a key step in the ongoing island-hopping campaign that the United States was using to push back Japanese forces in the Pacific. What made this attack unique was the use of the newly developed amphibious tractor, the LVT, often called the Alligator. These vehicles, designed to travel over both land and water, were used to carry troops and supplies across coral reefs that had long been considered impossible to cross by traditional military vehicles. In the eyes of the Japanese defenders, the reefs presented an unbreachable barrier, a natural defense that seemed to seal off the beaches from any large-scale amphibious assault. However, the Americans had a solution. The LVTs could navigate through these reefs, landing on beaches that were thought to be unreachable. The introduction of these vehicles changed the way future battles would be fought on the islands of the Pacific. This was a war-changing moment, one that would alter the course of the battle for the Pacific and dramatically shape the future of amphibious warfare. As the U.S. Marines prepared for the assault on Vella La Vella, they faced a difficult challenge. The island was strategically important to the Japanese, who had fortified the area with coastal defenses and had stationed troops in anticipation of a potential U.S. invasion. The Japanese believed their strongholds along the coast were safe, protected by the natural barrier of coral reefs. The reefs were not only difficult for landing craft to cross but also dangerous, with jagged formations capable of damaging or sinking an amphibious assault vessel. The idea of mounting a successful invasion across this terrain seemed impossible. The U.S. forces knew they had to find a way to bypass or overcome this obstacle if they were to succeed. The LVTs, with their wide tracks and powerful engines, were the solution. These vehicles were capable of traveling over water, including shallow reefs, and could also navigate the rough, sandy terrain of the islands. Designed in the early years of World War II for amphibious landings, the LVTs had proven themselves in battles in the Pacific and North Africa. The vehicles had been used in earlier assaults, such as those in the Battle of Tarawa, but their application on Vella La Vella would be a true test of their capabilities in the harsh conditions of the Solomon Islands. As the U.S. forces approached Vella La Vella, the Marines aboard the landing crafts were eager to witness the power of the new vehicles. The plan was to use the LVTs to carry troops and supplies across the reefs and onto the beaches, landing as close to the shore as possible, avoiding the need to struggle through the shallow waters where conventional boats might become stuck or sunk. The success of the operation depended on the LVT's ability to push through the reefs and deliver Marines where they were most needed, on solid ground, ready to fight. The landing began early in the morning, with the Marines pushing toward the shore. As the LVTs crawled across the coral reefs, their heavy tracks barely making a sound, the defenders on the island were caught off guard. Japanese soldiers, entrenched in defensive positions, had not anticipated that the Americans would be able to cross the reefs so easily. They had prepared for an assault from the sea, expecting landing crafts to face difficulty in crossing the coral, but they were wrong. The LVTs glided over the coral as if it were just another stretch of sand. The Japanese defenders, who had been watching the horizon for hours, were stunned by the appearance of the U.S. Marines. For them, it was as if the American forces had arrived out of nowhere, from a direction they had thought was impassable. The Japanese had no time to react to the surprise landing. As the LVTs reached the shore, U.S. Marines disembarked quickly and formed defensive positions. The amphibious tractors had done their job, delivering the men where they needed to be, but the battle was far from over. The Marines still had to face entrenched Japanese forces, well-armed and determined to hold their positions. As the U.S. forces pushed inland, the Japanese responded with artillery fire and small arms attacks. The terrain, rough and dense with tropical foliage, made it difficult to move quickly, but the Marines were well-trained and prepared for the challenges ahead. The battle for Vella La Vella turned into a brutal fight, with both sides suffering casualties. The Japanese forces, though surprised by the U.S. amphibious assault, had expected an invasion and had prepared for it. They put up fierce resistance, but the ability of the U.S. forces to land quickly and in strength turned the tide of the battle. The presence of the LVTs allowed for a rapid buildup of forces on the beaches and helped secure the initial foothold on the island. Without the LVTs, the assault would have been much more difficult, if not impossible. As the battle raged on, the Marines continued to rely on the LVTs to transport men and supplies across the beaches. Despite the difficult terrain, the vehicles proved their worth, transporting troops under fire and ensuring that the Marines had the supplies they needed to continue the fight. The amphibious tractors proved essential in the Marines' ability to maintain momentum and push deeper into Japanese-held territory. With each passing day, more LVTs landed on the beaches, bringing reinforcements and heavy equipment. The Japanese forces began to realize that their once secure coastal positions were no longer safe. The assault on Vella La Vella was a critical victory for the U.S. military. It marked a successful use of new tactics and technology in the Pacific, demonstrating the effectiveness of the amphibious tractor in overcoming the natural barriers posed by the coral reefs. The landing not only provided a strategic foothold on the island, but also demonstrated to both the U.S. and Japanese forces that the coral reefs, once thought to be an insurmountable barrier, could be crossed with the right equipment. For the Marines, the success of the operation was a testament to their adaptability and resourcefulness, as well as to the power of innovation in modern warfare. The event at Vella La Vella highlighted the importance of the amphibious tractor in the Pacific theater. It marked the beginning of a new phase in the war, one in which U.S. forces could land on virtually any beach, no matter how treacherous the terrain. This ability would prove essential in the coming battles for other Pacific islands, where coral reefs, shallow waters, and difficult beaches were common obstacles. The U.S. military had discovered a new way to fight, and this would have far-reaching consequences for the outcome of the war in the Pacific. The Amphibious Landing Vehicle, or LVT, was a crucial piece of military equipment that helped change the way the United States fought in the Pacific during World War II. Designed to solve a specific problem, the LVT was built to cross both land and water. Its main purpose was to transport troops and supplies from ships to shore during amphibious assaults. The vehicle was an essential tool in the island-hopping strategy that the U.S. used to advance across the Pacific, where most islands had rugged, difficult coastlines. The LVT's ability to navigate over coral reefs, which were considered impassable by other vehicles, made it a game-changer in the way U.S. forces could launch beach landings. The LVT was a hybrid vehicle. Unlike traditional vehicles that were either land-based or water-based, the LVT was designed to do both. Its body was large and boxy, with a smooth, reinforced hull that could cut through the water and glide onto the shore. The vehicle was powered by a gasoline engine that drove a set of wide tracks, similar to a tank, but adapted to work in both wet and dry environments. The engine provided enough power for the LVT to travel across water and sandy shores with ease. It could maintain a steady speed on land, but the vehicle's true strength was in its ability to operate in shallow water. The tracks were one of the most important features of the LVT. They were designed to distribute the weight of the vehicle over a large surface area. This made the vehicle capable of crossing beaches, mud flats, and shallow waters without sinking into the sand or getting stuck. In areas like the Solomon Islands, where coral reefs lined the shores, the LVT could crawl over the sharp edges of the coral and continue toward the beach. Traditional landing craft, such as Higgins boats, were unable to cross these reefs because their hulls would get damaged or stuck. The LVT, on the other hand, could easily glide over these obstacles, which gave U.S. forces a huge advantage in making successful landings. The vehicle's armor was light but effective enough to protect it from small arms fire, which was a common threat during beach landings. While the LVT wasn't heavily armored like a tank, it was built to withstand enough damage to keep moving in a combat zone. This was important because the Marines needed to be able to use the LVT to deliver supplies and men to the beaches quickly, without the vehicle being too weighed down or hindered by heavy armor. The lightweight armor helped keep the LVT fast and maneuverable while still offering basic protection against enemy fire. Originally, the LVT was designed for a different purpose. The vehicle was created to transport cargo and personnel from ships to shore. In the early years of the war, amphibious assaults were difficult and dangerous. Landing craft would often be forced to stay far from shore, leaving troops to wade through water under fire. The LVT was an answer to this problem. It could get closer to the shore, avoiding the need for troops to swim or wade in deep water. The vehicle could carry a group of soldiers and their equipment, delivering them directly to the battlefield. The LVT's primary role in combat was to assist in amphibious landings, particularly on beaches where traditional boats could not land. Many of the islands in the Pacific had coastal reefs that made beach landings difficult for standard landing craft. These reefs were shallow but dangerous. Landing boats would often be grounded before reaching the shore, forcing troops to wade through the water under heavy fire. In contrast, the LVT could crawl over these reefs, thanks to its wide tracks and lightweight design. The vehicle's tracks were able to spread the vehicle's weight over a larger surface area, allowing it to float over the shallow water and land directly on the beach. This ability made the LVT essential for U.S. forces in the Pacific, where many beaches were surrounded by coral reefs. As U.S. forces advanced in the Pacific, the LVT became an integral part of the strategy for capturing islands. The amphibious vehicle allowed the Marines to quickly establish a beachhead, the first step in any invasion. The LVTs would land first, carrying soldiers, supplies, and heavy equipment to secure the area. Once the beach was secured, other forces could land with more supplies and equipment to continue the assault. This method of landing troops close to the action reduced the time spent in vulnerable positions and kept the momentum of the attack going. The success of this tactic helped the U.S. forces push through island after island, gaining ground on the Japanese. The role of the LVT evolved over the course of the war. Initially, the vehicle was used for simple landings, transporting men and equipment to shore. However, as the war went on, the U.S. military adapted the LVT for more specialized tasks. The vehicle's capabilities were expanded to include the transportation of artillery pieces, heavy weapons, and even wounded soldiers. The LVT was also used to help clear beach obstacles, such as mines and barbed wire, which were often placed by the Japanese to slow down an assault. In some cases, the LVTs were fitted with small guns or flamethrowers to help clear enemy positions before the main assault force arrived. The success of the LVT in the Pacific was not just about its technical features but also about its adaptability in combat. The Marines used the vehicle to create a system of rapid landings that allowed them to overwhelm Japanese defenses. As the war progressed, the design of the LVT was refined and improved, with different versions made to carry more troops, carry heavier loads, or even support heavier firepower. The LVT's design evolved to meet the needs of the war as it continued, and its success led to the development of even more specialized amphibious vehicles in the years after World War II. One of the most important features of the LVT was its ability to make landings in places where other vehicles could not. This allowed U.S. forces to surprise the Japanese and quickly gain control of key beaches. The success of the LVT in the Solomon Islands and later in battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa made it clear that amphibious vehicles were essential for any future operations in the Pacific. The ability to land troops and equipment directly on a beach, regardless of the terrain, was a breakthrough in amphibious warfare. It allowed U.S. forces to avoid the delays and dangers of traditional landing craft and to press the attack more effectively. The LVT was a vital part of the U.S. strategy in the Pacific War. It allowed Marines to land on beaches that were once thought to be unreachable and to press the attack with greater speed and efficiency. The vehicle's unique design, lightweight armor, and amphibious capabilities made it a powerful tool for U.S. forces. It was one of the key innovations that helped turn the tide of the war in the Pacific. As the war continued, the LVT became a symbol of the United States' ability to adapt to new challenges and innovate under pressure. As the U.S. Marines approached the beaches of Vella La Vella, the landscape seemed unforgiving. The coral reefs that surrounded the island were jagged and treacherous, and the Japanese defenders believed these reefs would keep the Americans at bay. The Japanese had long considered the reefs to be an impenetrable barrier, a natural defense that would protect their fortified positions on the shore. They were ready for a traditional assault from the sea, but they had not prepared for what was coming. The Japanese forces had been fortified along the coast, expecting the typical landing craft to struggle against the reefs and shallow waters. Their belief was simple. If the Americans couldn't get past the reefs, they could not land on the beaches. The Japanese had already witnessed U.S. attempts to land on islands like Guadalcanal and Tarawa, where coral reefs had complicated beach assaults. The Japanese were confident that the coral reefs around Vella La Vella would work in their favor. making an invasion nearly impossible. But the U.S. Marines had something different in mind. The newly developed LVTs, amphibious vehicles capable of crossing both water and land, were the key to the plan. As the Marines began their assault on Vella La Vella, the sight of the LVTs crawling over the reefs caught the Japanese completely by surprise. The vehicles, with their wide tracks, glided across the jagged coral and continued their course toward the shore. To the Japanese soldiers, it was an unthinkable sight. They had been preparing for the standard Higgins boats, which could not cross the reefs, but the LVTs were capable of moving through the shallow waters with ease. The appearance of these vehicles, carrying troops and supplies, signaled a major shift in the battle. The U.S. Marines landed on the beaches with an unexpected advantage. The reefs that the Japanese had relied on as a natural defense were no longer a barrier. The Americans had found a way to bypass them. As the LVTs made their way across the coral, the Japanese defenders scrambled to respond. They had not anticipated the use of amphibious vehicles that could traverse both land and water. The element of surprise gave the Marines a crucial edge in the opening moments of the battle. As the first LVTs hit the shore, the Marines quickly disembarked under heavy enemy fire. The Japanese forces, though taken off guard, did not immediately break. They had prepared defensive positions along the beaches and were determined to hold them. The Marines, now on the beach, faced fierce resistance from entrenched Japanese positions. Despite this, the amphibious vehicles had already helped maintain momentum. The Marines had landed quickly and in force, and they were able to establish a foothold despite the ongoing fire. The LVTs had done their job, getting the troops to the shore and delivering the first wave of reinforcements. Now it was up to the Marines to push forward and take control of the island. The terrain posed its own set of challenges. The reefs, while passable for the LVTs, were still a difficult environment for combat. The sharp coral formations made movement difficult for both sides. For the Japanese, the reefs were an obstacle that limited their ability to maneuver. They were used to fighting from entrenched positions on the beach, but now their defensive lines were compromised. The Marines, on the other hand, adapted quickly to the environment. They had trained for amphibious landings and knew how to move efficiently across rough terrain. The LVTs provided them with a platform from which to launch their attack, but they still had to deal with the harsh realities of the island's geography. The conflict on the reef turned into a battle of adaptability. The Japanese soldiers fought fiercely from their positions, but they were slow to adjust to the new situation. The LVTs allowed the U.S. Marines to land in greater numbers and push deeper into the island than the Japanese had anticipated. While the Japanese struggled to adjust to the new tactics, the Marines made steady progress, using the terrain and the cover provided by the coral to their advantage. The LVTs, despite the challenges of the reef, continued to deliver supplies and troops, maintaining the momentum of the assault. For the Marines, the LVTs were not just transport vehicles. They were critical to keeping the attack moving. The vehicles moved slowly but steadily, crossing the reefs and delivering troops to key positions. As the Marines disembarked from the LVTs, they were able to take cover behind the vehicles while returning fire. The vehicles themselves provided a degree of protection, with their light armor offering some defense against the Japanese small arms fire. The LVTs also played a role in transporting heavy equipment, allowing the Marines to bring in heavier weapons like mortars and machine guns that would be crucial in breaking through the Japanese defenses. The Japanese response to the landing was quick but disorganized. Their belief in the invulnerability of the reefs meant that they had not prepared for a large-scale amphibious assault from this direction. As the LVTs continued to land, the Japanese attempted to regroup and launch counterattacks, but the momentum was already in favor of the Americans. The speed of the U.S. landing, aided by the LVTs, meant that the Japanese could not fully adjust their defensive positions. They were forced into a reactive posture, trying to adapt to a situation they had not anticipated. On the beaches of Vella La Vella, the battle raged on. The Marines, despite the challenges posed by the coral reefs and the entrenched Japanese defenses, continued to push forward. The LVTs, though slow and vulnerable, helped keep the momentum of the attack moving. With each new wave of troops and supplies that landed, the Marines were able to expand their foothold on the island, securing vital beachheads and pushing deeper into enemy territory. The Japanese, while still formidable in their resistance, were increasingly on the defensive. Their defensive positions, once thought to be impregnable, were being steadily eroded by the relentless U.S. assault. The Japanese soldiers, caught off guard by the appearance of the LVTs, struggled to adjust to the new tactics. The coral reefs, which they had believed would protect them, were no longer an obstacle for the advancing Americans. The battle on the reefs was a dramatic clash of expectations versus reality, with the Japanese struggling to adapt and the U.S. Marines making the most of their technological advantage. The LVTs, though not invincible, had proved their worth in the harsh environment of Vella La Vella, helping the Marines secure a crucial victory in the Pacific. As the first waves of U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Vella La Vella, the Japanese soldiers stationed on the island were caught completely off guard. They had long relied on the natural defense provided by the coral reefs. These reefs, jagged and shallow, were seen as an unbreachable obstacle for any amphibious assault. The Japanese had prepared their defensive positions with the assumption that no enemy force would be able to land effectively through such difficult terrain. They expected the American landing forces to be stalled long before they could reach the beach. But then the LVTs appeared. The sight of these vehicles crawling across the reefs was nothing short of astonishing to the Japanese defenders. They had never seen anything like it. The amphibious tractors, with their wide tracks and slow but steady movement, glided over the coral, inching closer to the beach with each passing moment. For the Japanese, the thought of enemy vehicles traversing the very terrain they had counted on to keep invaders at bay was unfathomable. Their disbelief was palpable as they watched this new kind of assault unfold before their eyes. The LVTs, which had once seemed like a minor innovation, were now the centerpiece of an assault they had not anticipated. To the Japanese, this was a moment of realization. The Americans had found a way to bypass their natural defenses. Culturally, the Japanese military was deeply rooted in defensive warfare. They had long focused on constructing fortified positions, expecting to withstand any attack. This was the strategy they had used across much of the Pacific. The idea of amphibious assaults was not foreign to them, but the scale and effectiveness of this new tactic was something they had never encountered. The Japanese soldiers were accustomed to fighting from fixed positions, often behind reinforced fortifications. To see the enemy bypass the natural barriers they had built their defenses around was an unsettling shock. The concept of an amphibious force moving directly across the coral reefs, landing troops without hesitation, was a game-changer in their perception of the war. It wasn't just an attack, it was an entirely new kind of warfare, one that rendered their defensive positions obsolete in a single, unexpected moment. For many of the Japanese soldiers, the appearance of the LVTs was more than just a shock. It was a realization of their vulnerability. Until that point, they had believed that the geographical features of the islands, such as coral reefs and rugged beaches, were enough to prevent any large-scale invasion. The reefs were not just a physical barrier but a psychological one. The Japanese had convinced themselves that no army could successfully assault these shores without great difficulty. But now, the sight of the LVTs gliding through the reefs revealed an overwhelming technological advantage on the part of the Americans, one that the Japanese had not prepared for. The amphibious vehicles, with their ability to traverse both land and water, completely undermined the Japanese strategy. This sense of vulnerability left many of the Japanese soldiers unsure of how to respond. What had once seemed like a secure position was now a dangerous, exposed one. On the other side of the battlefield, the U.S. Marines experienced a mixture of awe and determination. For them, the sight of the LVTs in action was a clear demonstration of the power of innovation and the strategic advantage it provided. They had been briefed on the capabilities of the LVT, but seeing it in action was a different experience entirely. The vehicles moved steadily across the reefs, and as they disembarked, the Marines understood that they had a real tactical advantage. This wasn't just another amphibious landing. It was a new way of war, one that would allow them to bypass the traditional barriers and press forward with greater speed and effectiveness. But despite the awe that the LVTs inspired, the Marines knew that their mission was far from over. The Japanese defenders were dug in, and fierce resistance awaited them on the beaches. The Marines had the technological edge, but the Japanese were still a formidable enemy. The sound of gunfire and explosions filled the air as the Marines pushed forward, disembarking from their LVTs and securing a foothold on the island. There was no time to bask in the initial success. The landing was just the beginning. The Japanese were not giving up their positions easily, and the Marines had to fight for every inch of ground. Even so, the successful use of the LVTs allowed the Marines to maintain momentum. In previous amphibious assaults, the landings had often been slow and disorganized, with troops bogged down in shallow waters or delayed by difficulties in reaching the beach. The LVTs had solved this problem, allowing the Marines to land swiftly and with minimal delay. This kept the Japanese on the defensive, preventing them from regrouping and fortifying their positions before the full force of the assault arrived. The element of surprise, combined with the steady flow of reinforcements and supplies, gave the Marines a strong advantage. It wasn't just about the technology, it was about the ability to keep the pressure on the enemy and deny them the time to prepare a counterattack. The Marines knew that this was only the beginning of a long and bloody battle, but the successful use of the LVTs filled them with a sense of tactical confidence. They understood that this was the future of amphibious warfare. The ability to land troops on seemingly impassable shores, to maintain a steady flow of supplies and reinforcements, was a breakthrough. The LVTs had changed the game, and the Marines were eager to use this new tool to their advantage in future campaigns. They saw the potential for using the LVTs to quickly establish beachheads, press deep into enemy territory, and sustain operations in areas that had once been considered too difficult to reach. It was a glimpse into a new kind of warfare, one that relied on speed, innovation, and the ability to adapt to the terrain. In the heat of battle, however, the Marines remained focused on the task at hand. They knew that the war was far from over. Despite the success of the initial landing, the battle for Vella La Vella would continue to be hard-fought. There would be more casualties, more resistance, and more challenges to overcome. But the success of the LVTs gave them hope and the confidence that they could continue to push forward. The tactical advantage that these vehicles provided was undeniable, and the Marines would carry that knowledge with them into every future operation. The surprise victory at Vella La Vella marked the beginning of a new chapter in amphibious warfare, and the Marines were determined to make the most of it. The battle on the beaches of the Solomon Islands was just the start of a larger, more complex campaign, but the use of the LVTs had already proven one thing: innovation and adaptability could turn the tide of battle. The success of the amphibious assault on Vella La Vella marked a critical turning point in the Pacific War. The use of the LVTs, which had successfully crossed the coral reefs and delivered U.S. Marines directly onto the beaches, led military planners to reassess the effectiveness of their amphibious strategies. What had once been considered an insurmountable obstacle, the reefs and shallow waters surrounding many Pacific islands, now appeared to be negotiable with the right technology. The result was a significant shift in how the U.S. conducted amphibious operations. The success at Vella La Vella became a model for future invasions across the Pacific. The LVTs allowed U.S. forces to land quickly and in greater numbers, reducing the vulnerability of the beachhead in the face of fierce enemy resistance. Previously, the risks associated with landing forces on heavily defended beaches were a major concern. Traditional landing crafts could only reach the shore with difficulty, often leaving troops exposed as they disembarked. The LVTs, however, offered a much more effective solution, enabling the U.S. Marines to land closer to their objectives and deliver troops and supplies in a way that was faster and less risky. With this capability, the LVT set a new standard for amphibious landings across the Pacific. The impact of the LVTs was most noticeable in subsequent assaults, such as the infamous invasion of Iwo Jima. There, the Marines again used amphibious vehicles to overcome the difficult terrain of the island. Iwo Jima's beaches were heavily fortified, and the Japanese defenders were well prepared for a traditional amphibious assault. However, the ability of the LVTs to cross the shallow waters and deliver troops directly onto the beach allowed the Marines to press the attack with greater speed and efficiency. The LVTs not only ensured that the Marines could land in force but also allowed them to carry heavier equipment and weapons with them, making the assault even more formidable. The LVT's effectiveness in these operations pushed the Japanese to reconsider their defensive strategies. The use of amphibious vehicles like the LVT highlighted a vulnerability in their coastal defenses that they had not anticipated. Japanese forces had relied heavily on the natural barriers provided by coral reefs, rugged shorelines, and dense jungle. They had expected these obstacles to provide a near-impenetrable defense. However, the success of the U.S. landings revealed that the Japanese coastal fortifications, while effective against traditional landing crafts, were not enough to stop the new wave of amphibious warfare. In response, the Japanese began to invest more heavily in coastal defenses. They strengthened their fortifications, laid more mines, and sought to develop better anti-amphibious tactics to prevent further successful landings. But by then, the U.S. had already gained a significant advantage. The ability to adapt to these changes and continue pushing forward was crucial to the success of the American campaign in the Pacific. The shift in tactics also had broader strategic consequences for the overall war effort. The success of the amphibious assaults provided the U.S. with a more reliable method of securing footholds on Japanese-held islands. This allowed the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps to continue their island-hopping campaign, bypassing heavily fortified positions and focusing on capturing strategically important islands. With each victory, the U.S. weakened the Japanese hold on the Pacific and moved closer to cutting off vital supply lines. The ability to launch quick and effective assaults on islands also allowed the U.S. to take the fight to the Japanese in a way that was previously impossible. The success of the LVTs demonstrated that the U.S. could land forces on islands that had been thought to be nearly impossible to reach. This, in turn, helped accelerate the collapse of Japan's defensive perimeter across the Pacific. The momentum shift in the Pacific was palpable after the success of these amphibious operations. As the U.S. gained the ability to successfully land on heavily fortified islands, Japanese defensive positions grew weaker. The element of surprise that the LVTs brought to the battle also helped disrupt Japanese plans. On islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the Japanese had expected a much more difficult fight, the U.S. Marines were able to land with more precision and in greater strength. The amphibious vehicles allowed the U.S. to press the attack more efficiently and keep Japanese forces off balance, forcing them to fight a defensive battle that they were ill-prepared for. The use of the LVTs also had an impact on the coordination between the Navy and Marines. With the ability to land forces more rapidly, the U.S. Navy was able to provide more consistent support for the Marines. The amphibious vehicles allowed for a steady flow of reinforcements, supplies, and heavier weaponry directly onto the beaches, minimizing the risk of running out of resources in the heat of battle. This continuous support made it possible for the Marines to sustain their efforts longer, pressing the Japanese defenders to their breaking point. The successful amphibious assaults and the ability to land on seemingly impassable shores marked a key turning point in the Pacific War. The U.S. was no longer forced to fight battles where the outcome was uncertain from the very start. The LVTs provided the Marines with the tools they needed to maintain the initiative and keep pushing forward, cutting off the Japanese from key islands and advancing steadily toward the heart of the empire. The shift in tactics, from slow, difficult landings to quick and decisive amphibious assaults, helped give the U.S. the upper hand in the Pacific. It allowed the U.S. to press forward, knowing that they had the ability to land on any beach and establish a foothold, no matter how well defended. The ability to sustain these operations, combined with the steady momentum of the island-hopping campaign, ultimately weakened Japan's defensive positions. As the U.S. Navy and Marines moved closer to the Japanese home islands, the pressure mounted. The Japanese, unable to stop the continuous U.S. advances, found themselves on the defensive. Each island captured brought the U.S. closer to Japan's vital supply lines, and each victory further eroded the strength of their forces in the Pacific. The combination of technological innovation and strategic insight gave the U.S. the tools to not just survive, but to dominate the Pacific theater, shifting the momentum toward a decisive victory. The success of the LVT during World War II had far-reaching consequences, shaping the future of amphibious warfare and military technology. The LVT was a groundbreaking piece of equipment that allowed U.S. forces to land on beaches that were previously thought to be inaccessible. After the war, the lessons learned from the use of the LVT influenced the development of new military vehicles, including modern amphibious landing crafts. In the years following the war, the U.S. military and other armed forces around the world saw the importance of amphibious vehicles. The success of the LVT demonstrated the need for vehicles that could deliver troops and supplies to shore quickly and safely, even in areas with difficult terrain, such as coral reefs or shallow waters. As a result, the development of amphibious landing craft advanced significantly. New designs were created to meet the challenges of modern warfare, with vehicles that could carry more troops, heavier equipment, and provide better protection for the soldiers inside. These post-war innovations built on the foundation laid by the LVT, using its principles to create even more effective machines for amphibious assaults. Modern amphibious forces, such as the U.S. Marines, owe much of their capabilities to the experiences gained from World War II with the LVTs. The LVT's success during the Pacific campaigns helped solidify the importance of amphibious operations in military strategy. Today's U.S. Marines still rely on amphibious vehicles to carry out beach landings and assaults, adapting the lessons learned from World War II to new threats and environments. The ability to land on beaches and quickly establish a foothold has remained a core part of military doctrine. The LVT proved that it was possible to strike at the heart of an enemy's defense by bypassing their coastal fortifications, a strategy that is still used in modern amphibious operations. The success of the LVT also had a lasting impact on military doctrine. The lessons learned from its use during World War II reshaped how military planners approached conflicts that involved coastal terrain. The ability to launch an amphibious assault anywhere, even on heavily defended shores, became a key element of military planning. In future conflicts, amphibious operations became a central part of many campaigns, particularly in areas where traditional land-based forces could not easily advance. The LVT helped to prove that amphibious warfare could be conducted effectively, even in hostile environments. This idea has influenced military doctrine in the decades since, with amphibious vehicles being a standard part of military arsenals around the world. Beyond traditional combat, amphibious vehicles have had a broader impact on military strategies. The use of amphibious vehicles is now standard practice in operations that require rapid deployment, such as peacekeeping missions or disaster relief efforts. These vehicles have become a vital tool in modern military strategy, allowing forces to respond quickly to crises in coastal regions. Whether it is providing humanitarian aid after a natural disaster or securing a strategic location during a conflict, amphibious vehicles play a crucial role. The lessons learned from the LVT have influenced these operations, ensuring that forces can reach even the most remote locations when needed. In the years after the war, the LVT became more than just a symbol of wartime innovation. It represented a shift in military thinking. No longer were forces limited by the terrain they encountered. The amphibious assault proved that, with the right equipment, even the most difficult landscapes could be overcome. Today, amphibious vehicles continue to be a key component of military and humanitarian operations, as they were during World War II. The legacy of the LVT is seen in the continued evolution of amphibious warfare vehicles, which have adapted to meet the demands of modern combat while remaining true to the lessons of the past. The impact of the LVT also reached beyond the military. The technological innovations that came from the development of the LVT have influenced civilian engineering, especially in areas such as amphibious transportation. The design of amphibious vehicles has been adapted for use in civilian applications, from transporting people and goods across water to responding to natural disasters in coastal areas. The LVT's legacy has been carried into civilian uses, where the ability to move seamlessly between land and water remains a valuable capability. The principles behind the LVT, including its adaptability and efficiency, have proven to be relevant in a variety of contexts, far beyond their original military purpose. As the LVT shaped the course of World War II and future conflicts, it also contributed to a broader understanding of how military forces could overcome natural barriers. Its success changed how military planners thought about logistics, mobility, and the importance of innovation in warfare. The LVT was more than just a vehicle. It was a testament to the ingenuity and adaptability of the forces that used it. Today, the lessons learned from the development and use of the LVT continue to inform military and humanitarian strategies around the world. The evolution of amphibious warfare, powered by the technology that the LVT introduced, remains an essential part of modern defense and emergency response capabilities.